Erev Tov, Chavrim, I'm Stephen Ben-Nun. You're watching Israeli News Live, and a very interesting broadcast this evening. Friends, this is a very serious, very somber broadcast, what I want to be bringing out to you, a prophetic insight of the current situation that is happening there in the Middle East with Israel, Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, the United States, Russia, and many others. I'm sure there's those that believe that we're facing Psalm 83 war. There are those that believe this is Gog of Magog. Of course, Psalm 83, in my opinion, was never a war to begin with. It is certainly the enemies of Israel that are gathering together in a confederacy against Israel to take Israel down. And I believe that that's where that stands at. But when it comes to Gog of Magog, that is a war that comes against Israel. But there's prophecies much deeper, those that have been totally overlooked by the rabbinic community, by the Christian scholars, etc., and something that the Lord has shown me recently. And this message tonight is a direct warning to both Israeli leaders as well as the Syrian leaders, and of course many other leaders in the world today. When I say a warning, it is prophecies that has been brought out through the biblical canon. Prophecies that were brought out that is accepted by all three monotheistic religions of today. Both the Jews that believe in the Tanakh, their Bible, the Torah, the book of Genesis, Bereshit, as well as the Christian community accepting the Tanakh also as they call it, the Old Testament, and even the Muslims who actually believe the writings of Moses to be inspired of God Himself. And the writings that we're going to look at is actually a prophecy from a Syrian himself that was written by Moses, penned in the very book of Genesis. And so a warning comes to both Israel and to Syria as well, as I have watched biblically what has happened in the past, what was prophesied, and what is happening today. But it doesn't end with Israel. It doesn't end with the modern state of Israel, I should say, but it also affects the United States, NATO, Russia as well. Because the house of Israel that was dispersed through the entire world, remnants of the different tribes, whether it be Ephraim, Manasseh, Naphtali, Dan, whatever it may be that has been dispersed to the rest of the world, you're also involved in the prophecies that have been written, what we're going to be speaking about tonight. Looking at the book of Isaiah, Yeshayahu that is, Bereshit, Genesis. Also, Micah. We'll be also looking at Melachim, Aleph Melachim, First Kings, as well as possibly the Second Kings as well. We're going to be looking even at one statement that Yeshua made, Jesus of Nazareth. But I implore my Jewish brothers and sisters, and I implore the Syrian people and President Bashar al-Assad and Prime Minister Netanyahu, the cabinet ministers from both respective countries, to pay close heed to what I'm about to share with you today. Because it is important. And it has everything to do with what is happening today in the countries around the entire Middle East. Let's take a look at a couple of news reports before we get started here. The Times of Israel reports Iran-backed forces could be 3 miles from Israel under Syrian deal. The report. Israel says agreement does not go far enough in moving Iran and affiliated militias away from the Golan Heights border. Just one of the many issues that are going on. And of course, this is an older article, a couple of days old already. We're also, or from yesterday actually. Then we have Israel will continue acting in Syria, Netanyahu tells U.S. and Russia. And by the way, U.S. and Russia, there may be some that may disagree with me when I make some of the statements I'm going to make here, but I just ask you, as a brother in kindness, bear with me for a little bit. If we look at the United States as being descendants of Ephraim, if we look at Russia as a possibility of descendants of Manasseh, and some would argue it's the other way around, Manasseh is the United States and Ephraim is Great Britain, there are remnants in all over the globe, no matter which tribe you're from. I was talking to Dr. Steve Pidgeon of the Sefer group not too long ago about Manasseh And he believes, and has some very powerful, strong points, that the Russian people of today, not just any of the Russian people, but the Russian Orthodox Church, has a lot to do with the remnants of Manasseh, the tribe of Manasseh. And if we look at this from a biblical prophecy, what I'm going to share with you tonight, that has profound reaching effects about what we're going to talk about. Ephraim, clearly, not only is he in Damascus, according to Isaiah 17, but Ephraim also represents the entire house of Israel, the 10 tribes that were dispersed throughout the entire world. But there are some that believe, whether it be Britain or whether it be the United States, that Ephraim was actually scattered into those areas. And so therefore I take it just as a conjecture. We say Ephraim being the United States or NATO and their allies altogether. Not every country, of course, because Turkey would not be a part of that, but nonetheless, keep that in mind. All right? Now, as we get into this, this is where it gets very interesting. I want to start in Genesis chapter 31. And I want to say, before I even get started, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I know that there are cabinet ministers, or I should say there are Knesset members in Israel that listen to Israeli News Live. I'm trusting that someone will get this message to Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I trust that there is someone that will get this as well to President Bashar al-Assad. And I know that President Bashar al-Assad knows about Israeli News Live as well as does Prime Minister Netanyahu. When we look at the situation, before I go into Genesis, we look at the situation where Prime Minister Netanyahu is complaining about Iran being inside of Syria and the global influence of Iran, whether it be in Yemen, Syria, other regions of the world that they're claiming, Libya, etc. I have to sit back and look and realize that Iran's influence inside of Syria happens to be our own fault. And I say our own fault because I am Jewish by birth. And I know I appreciate those that have written, and you've made your comments where I've brought this up before, had Israel gone in and taken out ISIS and gone and become a partner with Syria, a partner with Russia. Russia is an ally to Israel. Many would say, oh no, Russia is Gog of Magog. I don't agree with that. I think the Gog of Magog is going to have more to do with a Turkish back, possibly even a NATO movement against Israel in the future. But I'm not going to judge. Maybe Russia is Gog of Magog. But my point that I want to make here is that Russia at this time is an ally to Israel, just like the United States is an ally to Israel. The U.S. no doubt is a greater ally to Israel because the U.S. funds the military for Israel, etc. And so therefore Israel considers the U.S. a greater ally. But in both cases, 2 million of the 8 million population in Israel today happen to be Russian Jews. And of course, we have a sizable American Jewry inside of Israel today as well. But we also have Iranian Jews. We have Yemenite Jews. We have Jews from all over the world living in Israel today. But when I look at this situation here, this whole issue with Iran being in Syria could have easily been stopped had Israel joined with the Syrian government and with President Putin and President Bashar al-Assad and defeated the common enemy of ISIS. Unless, somewhere in the background, we had a part with ISIS. That's the sad part. Now, we know that John McCain, President Obama, had a big hand in making sure ISIS militants got the right funding they needed. I've got a friend of mine in the Israeli military, retired, that shared with me that there was rumors spreading that certain ISIS members were seen wearing tzitzit, which clearly suggested an Israeli involvement of some sort. We know that when the Russians bombed the secret base that was directing Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and the ISIS militants that was bombed by Russia's bunker buster up in Aleppo that killed agents from CIA, Mossad, Saudis, Qatar, etc. Turkey had agents all working in there doing the direction of the operations. That was Russia's retaliation when lost many of their own men when the NATO forces near Deir ez-Zor over a year ago bombed continuously for over an hour, killing some 60-something Syrian soldiers, as well as about a dozen Russian troops. That was never reported in mainstream media. At least the Russian death toll was not reported. The whole bombing incident was reported. The U.S. claimed it was a mistake, apologized later. Oops, sorry, we did it. But it gave ISIS the upper hand. It was clear and evident that the coalition was working to support ISIS militants. And as we have seen more and more, these unmarked helicopters in these last days of the war of ISIS being defeated by Russian and Syrian troops there, that has been the case. There has been a lot of suggestion that the U.S. is backing them. So my question is, if ISIS truly is an enemy of Israel, why did we not join our brother Bashar al-Assad in fighting ISIS and defeating this enemy so that a closer to a democracy in Syria could have prevailed? Why do we back al-Nusra or al-Qaeda? Now, I know publicly we have not backed them as far as an Israeli government, but clearly it has been evident that we certainly have not backed President Bashar al-Assad. And I say this because Syria is the homeland for the mothers of Israel, Leah and Rachel. And this is where we begin to look at the prophetic insight of this. So I brought this out about ISIS because I already know, friends, I know that there is a suspicion of Israel's involvement in this situation of ISIS, whether it be directly or indirectly, or even if it's just wishful thinking of the toppling of Bashar al-Assad to replace it with some horrible government instead. There will definitely not be for the Jewish people. Who knows? But it's obvious that what General Wesley Clark saw in the memo, that the U.S. was going to take down 7 nations, and it include Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Sudan, Libya, etc. They're definitely trying to be on target. Maybe not on time, but on target. Now, let's move to Genesis chapter 31 to start with here. We know that in the case of the story of Jacob, Yaakov, when he goes to, he has to leave his mother and goes to look for a wife with her brother, Laban, who was a Syrian, lived in Syria. And at the time, he had deceived his brother Esau to get the birthright. And he got the birthright. But of course, it made Esau very angry. And Jacob flees into Syria. And of course, on the way, Esau's sons strip him of all of his money, all of his wealth. Everything is taken from him. And he goes penniless unto Laban. But he works for 14 years. First for Leah, not his choice, but he did it anyway because he was deceived. And then another 7 years for Rachel. And then still yet even more years for the cattle themselves that he was given as his wage. There was a big contention between the two men because Laban naturally changed his wages 10 times. Even Jacob, though, deceived his own father-in-law in order to gain more of the cattle. So it was back and forth. But nonetheless, the hand of the Lord was upon Jacob and showed kindness unto him because he knew that he would be the father of many nations. Let's get into the story where we pick up here, where it's time for Jacob to leave Laban. And he does it rather secretly because he fears that Laban would try to take away his wives as well. Chapter 31, verse 3. And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return into the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with you. And Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field and to his flock, and said unto them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not toward me as before, but the God of my father hath been with me. And you know that with all my power I have served your father. And your father has mocked me, changed my wages 10 times, but God suffered him not to hurt me. If he had said thus, the speckled shall be thy wages, then all the flock bore speckled. And if he had said thus, the streaked shall be thy wages, then bore all the flock streaked. Now, we know the true story behind it. He uses the poplar sticks, causes the animals to conceive, to actually bear the way Jacob wanted to do so. So there was deceiving on both sides when it comes to that. Now, as we move down, of course, we know they leave. They're headed back to the the land where his father Abraham and Isaac lived at, back to what we'd call the modern state of Israel today. And as they do, on the way there, Laban hears about what he has done. He's left without saying goodbye, without doing anything, and of course taking the cattle, his wives, his children, etc. with him. Watch what Laban says here as this unfolds here as we go further down to verse 27. So Laban says, "Wherefore didst thou flee secretly and outwit me? Didst not you tell me that I might have sent you away with mirth and with songs, with tabret and with harp? And didst not suffer me to kiss my sons and my daughters? How hast thou done foolishly? It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt, but the God of your father spoke unto me yesternight, saying, Take heed to thyself, that thou speak not to Jacob, either good or bad. And now that thou art surely gone, because thou sore longest after thy father's house, wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? And Jacob answered and said to Laban, Because I was afraid, for I said, Lest thou shouldest take thy daughters from me by force." Okay? Now, "With whomsoever thou findest thy gods, he shall not live. Before our brethren discern thou what is thine with me, and take it to thee. For Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them." And we get into a lot about this here. I have wondered if because of what Jacob said, could this have a direct effect on the fact that Rachel did not live longer than the birthing of her two sons, Joseph and Benjamin. I don't know. Just a thought there. But as the story goes down, and we'll skip over some of this here. He goes, he searches among them. Of course, Rachel is sitting on it. She says it's a time of that's upon women, so she does not rise up. Laban suppers her. He doesn't bother with his daughter there, but he searches all over. He doesn't find them. Jacob is angry over this because Jacob has no idea that Rachel has taken the flocks there, right? All right, so then we get down to around verse 41, and Jacob begins to show his side. "These 20 years have I been in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy two daughters, and 6 years for thy flock. And thou hast changed my wages 10 times. Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac have been on my side. Surely now hast thou sent me away empty. God hath seen mine affliction, and the labor of my hands, and gave judgment yesternight." And Laban answered and said unto the Jacob, and this is where I want you to really pay close attention. "The daughters are my daughters. The children are my children. And the flocks are my flocks. And all that thou seest is mine. And what can I do this day for these my daughters, for their children whom they have borne? And now come, let us make a covenant, I and you. And let it be for a witness between me and you." And Jacob took up a stone and set up for a pillar. And Jacob said unto his brethren, "Gather stones." And they took stones and made a heap. And they did eat there by the heap. They actually ate bread. And Laban called it Yegah Sahudatha. But Yaakov, or Jacob, called it Galid. And Laban said, "This heap is witness between me and thee this day." Therefore was the name of it called Galid. And Mizpah, for he said, "The Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent from one another." That's important. That is the most important right there. That is prophetic. Laban said, for he said, "The Lord watch between me and you when we are absent from one another. If you shall afflict my daughters, and if you shall take wives besides my daughters, no man being with us, see, God is witness between me and you." No man. No one else. Watch what Laban is saying. President Bashar al-Assad, are you listening? The Syrian people, are you listening? Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Knesset members in all Israel, the rabbis in Israel and around the world, are you listening to what Laban says here? This is a prophecy that he speaks here. And no one has ever taken the time to see the prophecy that Laban the Syrian spoke to Jacob. And Laban said to Jacob, behold this heap, and behold the pillar which I have set up betwixt me and thee. This heap be a witness, and the pillar be a witness, that I will not pass over this heap to do thee, and that thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me for harm. Okay? The God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of their father judge betwixt us. And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. And Jacob offered a sacrifice in the mountain and called his brethren to eat bread. And they did eat bread and tarried all night in the mountain. Now, two things happened here. All right? One, both men swore an oath by the God of Abraham and Nahor. It's their same grandfather. They also swore Jacob by the fear of his own father Isaac, when the blessing came to him from, that neither man would cross over that heap of rocks to do the other harm. Not only that, Laban prophesies. You may not think it's a prophecy, but it's a prophecy. If you take any other daughters, or you afflict my daughters, not just take another wife, but if you afflict Israel, God will judge between me and thee. Though we be apart, and though there be no man, notice that, there would be no man to see it. Alright? Now, so that's one reason why I say, as the people of Israel, living in the promised land that we have returned home after 2,000 years of exile, why are we crossing over the heap into Syria to do Syrians harm? Who are the children of our ancestry through our mothers of Israel, Leah and Rachel. Why have we broken the covenant? Now, I'm not saying the covenant has not been broken on both sides. President Bashar al-Assad, your father, 1973, launched an attack on Israel. This is when you lost the Golan. And I know many other situations that have happened. And I know since the civil war has been going on, Prime Minister Netanyahu, you have launched attacks, in some cases claiming to be striking at Hezbollah weapons moving into Lebanon, when you have intentionally targeted Syrian military to try to slow the advance of Bashar al-Assad against Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra. And these are not your relatives. These are not your people. They're not from the mothers of Israel. They're not Laban's daughters. If you remember when we came to the land with Moses, when Joshua ben Nun brought in the children of Israel and crossed the border to take the land, we were to drive out the occupants. The occupants were part of Nephilim descent. The Philistines, the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Jebusites. But God commanded us not to touch Esau's children, even though the prophecy said, I loved Jacob and I hated Esau. But he said to Moses, leave Esau alone. Leave Ishmael alone, the Ammonite. We were commanded. But the reason why we drove out the occupants in the land is because they had inbred with the Nephilim, the giants that were in the land. It was not even a human race. It was demonic race that somehow or another had sprung up into this region of the promised land, and they were to be driven out. But not your brethren. Now, I know, as I said, the covenant has been broken. And even people would say today, well, Syria drove the house of Israel into exile. Sure they did. Why? Because of the sins of the house of Israel. Because of idolatry that got into the house of Israel. Ahab. Alright? Now let me remind my Christian friends something. We think about Syria. Because people say immediately, well, Damascus is going to be a ruinous heap. Have you read the rest of the chapter to see why? We're going to get into that in a minute. Let me remind you, though, 2,000 years ago when Jesus of Nazareth, Yeshua, When He walked the earth, what did it say about Him? And Jesus went about Galilee. This is in Matthew chapter 4, verse 23 to 25. Teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom, healing all manner of sickness and all manner of disease among the people. And His fame went throughout all Syria. And they brought unto Him all sick people that were taken with divers diseases and torments, and those which were possessed with devils, and those which were lunatic, and those that had the palsy, and He healed them. And there followed Him great multitudes of people from Galilee, from Decapolis, and from Jerusalem, from Judea, and from beyond Jordan. Why? When the house of Israel, 780 years before Yeshua walked upon the scene, when they were dispersed, many of them throughout Syria, Damascus, they were some of the first believers. Not just the house of Israel, but also the fact Laban's children and grandchildren and so forth and so on, and his descendants. They believed the testimony of Yeshua. And some of the oldest Christian churches today standing there in Syria. And have we forgotten that many of the remnants of the house of Israel are known as Syrians today? Now, may I remind you as well. Let's go over here to 1 Kings chapter 20. And verse 1, And Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, gathered all his hosts together, and there were 32 kings with him, and horses and chariots. And he went up and besieged Samaria, and fought against it. And he sent messengers to Ahab, king of Israel, into the city, and said unto him, Thus hath Ben-Hadad, thy silver and thy gold is mine. Thy wives also, and thy children, even the goodliest, are mine. And the king of Israel answered and said, It is according to thy saying, my lord, O king, I am thine and all that I have. Now, I bring this up for a reason. Why does Ahab? Now, Ahab is just a roustabout for a king. Totally backslidden, brought idolatry into Israel by marrying Jezebel. But do you know why the king Ben-Hadad said what he did? Because it was a reminder to Israel of the prophecy of Laban. If you take another wife other than my daughters, God judge between me and thee, though we be apart. And what did Laban say? These daughters are mine. These children are mine. And he said, all the cattle you have is mine. Did Yaakov argue the fact? No. He mentioned about how his wages were changed 10 times, how he was cheated, and how he did work for what he got. But he never said anything contrary to what Laban said that day. That truly they were Yaakov's wives, Rachel and Leah. But the point is, Laban prophesied, if you take another wife, God judge between me and thee. Now, because Ben-Hadad did not have the right humility, God lets him suffer defeat in the beginning. But eventually, the house of Israel goes into captivity. Elijah and Elisha both warned of this. But you know, it wasn't Ben-Hadad that did the dirty work against the house of Israel. It was Hazael, the very man that murdered King Ben-Hadad of Syria. And then a wicked king stands up in his place and does all this wickedness against the house of Israel. But the point is, Israel's sin was taking a wife that was not of the children of Israel. That was taking a wife that was not of the seed of Abraham. That was not of the children of Abraham and Sarah. But instead brought idolatry into Israel and married Jezebel. Let's move over to 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 31, and it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ithbaal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. No wonder why God had the Syrians raise up against us. Same thing with the house of Judah. When the house of Judah goes 70 years into captivity up into what we call today modern day Iran under Nebuchadnezzar. Why? Because of the sins of the house of Judah. And he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab made the Asherah. And Ahab did yet more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, than all the kings of Israel that were before him. You don't think it wasn't a problem? Major problem. Remember when Elijah comes down there and when Ahab sees him coming, he says, "Here's a man that troubles Israel." And Elijah says, "Nay, you're the one troubling Israel." And isn't it interesting that this all happens right about the time of what we would call the tribulation of that day, when Elijah stopped the heavens and it rained not for 3.5 years, very much like the coming of the two witnesses. And believe me, the times has not changed. But I've got to share with you something I think that is very profound in itself. If we go to Genesis chapter 32, after Laban and Jacob settle their differences, they make an altar, a heap, a memorial, not to pass over that heap to do the other harm. And so as Israelis today, we need to honor that covenant. As Syrians, President Bashar al-Assad, you have to honor the covenant of your forefathers. Laban. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, you must honor this covenant. You cannot let the outside influence, as you have done, cause you to go to war against your own people. Watch what happens though. And we're going to be doubling back in just a moment. Chapter 32, and early in the morning Laban rose up, kissed his sons and his daughters, and blessed them. And Laban departed and returned unto his place. You see, President Bashar al-Assad, you cannot condemn Israel. It's your family. It's your children. It's your children's children. You are of the same family. And Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. This is what gets me. Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him, and Jacob said, when he saw them, "This is God's camp," and he called the name of that place Mahanaim. Are you serious? He sees a company of angels and realizes that the angels of God are with him. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother unto the land of Seir, the field of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, "Thus shall you say unto my lord Esau, Thus saith thy servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now." But he was returning home. This is what I don't understand. Jacob sees a company of angels. God said he would be with him. And now, as he's going back to the homeland, instead of going back there, knowing that God is with him, he begins to try to buy off his brother, Esau. And Esau, at the time, has not forgot what Jacob did to him in deceiving him for the birthright. But of course, Esau considered it a small thing. Right? But here's what's interesting. Jacob, and of course we know he's going to wrestle with God, but what does Jacob do? He sends presents on before. He divides up his people, a band with Leah and a band with Rachel and their children, and those children apart, and sends out his the handmaidens of his concubines as well, and divides them up and their children apart. All these children being divided up. And he sends gifts with each group. The one that he least favors the most, he sends out first. So Leah's handmaid goes first, then Rachel's handmaid, then Leah and her children go, and then finally Rachel, he goes with Rachel and of course Joseph and Benjamin, because this is his beloved. Or Benjamin's not born yet. Okay? And I'm blown away by this. Trying to buy off his brother because he's afraid of him after God's already showed him he's with him and he sees the angels. He wrestles all night with the angel of the Lord, but still, after wrestling with the angel of the Lord, being blessed of the angel of the Lord, he still has to buy off his brother Esau because he's afraid. Maybe I would have been in the same shoes. I can't say that I would have done different. But it's interesting to me, and I'll show you why. History is only repeating itself. Okay? History is only, once again, happening in modern days. Of course, this picture here from September 28, 2016, Times of Israel. I believe this is when Shimon Peres is already passed away. But those of you that remember, it is Shimon Peres, back in 1993, that worked with the Vatican, trying to bring about a two-state solution. Well, there are some that would argue that the two-state solution was never signed, but that's not true. They signed that two-state solution. All right? It was a done deal. We know that Ariel Sharon, according to one of our good friends, Zev, who had a friend that was there, one of the aides to Ariel Sharon, that said that all the world leaders were there. It was kept secret, kept away from the public, and they signed a two-state deal. Shimon Peres was the father of that. He is basically a modern-day Ahab. Now, I'm not saying that Ahab didn't repent and God accepted his repentance in sackcloth and ashes. But nonetheless, he still married Jezebel and brought idolatry into Israel. And so did Shimon Peres. He married Jezebel, the Catholic Church, the Pope of Rome, who later fulfilled the prophecy of Obadiah. All right? And let me just share that with you. Those of you that may not even know what we're talking about when we say the prophecy of Obadiah. All right? Sure he did. He takes in Obadiah, when Obadiah prophesies, there's only one chapter to Obadiah. All right? You get down to, I think it's verse 14 or 16. 16 is where it is. For as you have drunk upon my holy mountain, so shall all the nations drink continually. Yea, they shall drink and shall swallow down and shall be as though they had not been. That may not seem like a whole bunch to you. But in Hebrew, kika shashutetem, masculine plural, al-ha, okay, for as they have drank, there's the they, masculine plural, upon al-ha kodeshi, upon my holy mountain. All right? And that was fulfilled with the Pope of Rome, with the male-only delegation that drank in the upper room there in 2014 on Passover. And then it goes on to say, after the comma, Ishatu kol hagoim tamid. And, of course, they, that's gender inclusive, all denominations, or both men and women, continue to drink, and that's continually tamid, upon the Gentiles, upon, of course, what? The holy mountain. And they shall swallow down, etc., etc., etc. All right, so what is it? The Pope of Rome fulfilling prophecy after what? After, of course, Shimon Peres marries him, right? And when we say marry, then we have to remember, and this is one of the articles that we had wrote ourselves on Israeli News Live, Mekodeshet, the ecumenical movement, destined to fail, because it will fail. But as you notice here, Daniel 11:14, I quote this, and in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also, the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish divisions, but they shall fail. Now, it more accurately should be translated, the sons of the lawless will try to marry the vision, or still lift up the vision. That's Daniel's vision. They're trying to bring about Daniel's prophecy that brings about reconciliation for iniquity. Remember that? They're trying to bring about a false millennial reign. And what is it? It's Ahab marrying Jezebel. It is the prophecy of Laban all the way over in Genesis here, 31, where Laban says, if you take other wives unto yourselves and my daughters, and no man be here with you, God judge between us. Just like Ahab took Jezebel, Israel in modern times married not only Rome, but you've even married the Saudis. At least with Rome, we know what you did. All right? Now, I'm going to show you even what gets worse. Isaiah 17, We're going to drop back down here to verse 10 in just a moment. This is where we find the burden of Damascus. Behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap, a prophecy that is nearing the time of fulfillment. And believe me, let Israel go against the Iranians inside of Syria, and they'll use that excuse to level Damascus. And I know this because Isaiah is going to put the blame on Israel for letting it happen. But it's going to go much deeper than just Israel. The cities of Aurora are forsaken. They shall be for flocks which shall lie down, and none shall make them afraid. The fortress also shall cease from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus. Why is the fortress cease from Ephraim? Because this little president called Bashar al-Assad has taken a stand for the Christian community living in his country, the Eastern Orthodox Christians. He has fought for their protection. But when Damascus falls, so will the fortress of Ephraim. Why Ephraim? Because it represents remnants of the house of Israel that are living there in Damascus. And the kingdom from Damascus and the remnant of Aram, or Syria, Syria is in King James, they translate that as Syria, shall be as the glory of the children of Israel, saith the Lord of hosts. Why? Because you'll be just a remnant. And after all, you're cousins. Okay? Now, as we move down, and it shall come to pass in that day that the glory of Jacob shall be made thin, and the fatness of his flesh shall wax lean. It's true. And it shall be as when the harvestman gathereth the standing corn and reapeth the ears with his arm. Yea, it shall be as when one gleaneth the ears in the valley of Rephaim. Alright, now let's drop down to verse 10. Let's go to verse 9. In that day shall his strong cities be as the forsaken places which were forsaken after the manner of the woods and lofty forests. And it shall be a desolation. For thou hast forgotten the God of thy salvation. The prophet Isaiah is speaking to Israel. And thou hast not been mindful of the rock of thy stronghold. You forgot that little man called Jesus of Nazareth. You forgot about the man called Yeshua or Yeshu by the apostles years ago. When they called that little guy Yeshu, and thou hast not been mindful of the rock of thy stronghold, therefore thou didst plant plants of pleasantness and didst set it with slips of a stranger. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Slips of a stranger. You set it with slips of a stranger. The word slips, by the way, is like a branch. You plant it. Actually, the word is sowed. You got zarah. Okay? And over here, Zarah, it's actually kind of reverse order in the way it's laid out. There is where you have planted, you have sown, alright? You have sown like a branch, but it's actually right there, the word zar is with adultery. Why? You know, it's pretty obvious. Go to verse 11 and 12. In the day of thy planting thou didst make it to grow, and in the morning thou didst make thy seed to blossom, a heap of boughs in the days of grief and desperate pain. Ah, the uproar of many peoples that roar like the roaring of the seas, and the rushing of nations that rush like the rushing of mighty waters. You see what happened when you married Jezebel? And you know what's interesting? When you married Jezebel in modern days and you married Rome and you brought the Vatican into Israel, you did just like Jacob did when you knew God was with you, when God proved that He was with you in 1948, when God proved He was with you in 1967. But what did you do anyway? What did you do? You took and you sent a present to Esau, to the Vatican. You sent presents trying to buy favor because you're afraid of Esau. And I know that Rome is where Esau is at, because clearly in Obadiah it clearly identifies Edom in the one, Edom being that one that destroyed the temple and the sanctuary. Because Obadiah says you were as one of them. in the day of your calamity. That was when, what? 70 AD. You were as one of them. So God indicts Rome, Titus the Roman general, as being one with what? The Syrians that were doing his dirty work. Why? Because Rome had already conquered the Syrians anyway. So the Syrians were bowing down and having to do the fighting for what? For, of course, Rome, ancient Rome, 2,000 years ago. And of course, the Vatican is only that descendants carrying on that work today. And so Esau is remnant of the Romans. And it's interesting, Pope Francis happens to be a Roman. His very parents themselves. All right? Now, as we say though, because of this marriage, and because the Mekodeshet, that big organization where the Vatican sponsored this new reconciliation of iniquity, and the word Mekodeshet means to engage or to be espoused. You married in Rome into Israel. And what did you do? You brought idolatry in just like Ahab did. And as a result of this, now by adulterous act, you have planted in branches that don't belong. And that is what's called the rushing of nations. Rush like rushing of mighty waters. The nation shall rush like rushing of mighty waters, but he shall rebuke them, and they shall flee far off, and shall be chased as the chaff of the mountains before the wind, and like the whirling dust before the storm. That's because what? The rock of your salvation will have to step in on your behalf. Our behalf, not just your behalf, but will have to step in on our behalf because of the huge mistakes that we're making. Let me share with you a few other things here in closing here. Talking about being married there with Rome, you also, here's one of those adulterous plants you made with the Saudis. This was on Mamre television. One of these guys here was being interviewed about making a deal with Israel. But then he says normalization doesn't mean that we have to make peace. Do you think that the Saudis are going to be peaceful for Israel in the long run? No. He says right here on national television. And no wonder you take these strange slips and make these marriages and you think it's going to do you good. Remember over here in 1 Kings chapter 22, and the king of Israel said unto Jehoshaphat, there is yet one man by whom we may inquire of the Lord, Micah, the son of Imlah. But I hate him, for he doth not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. And Jehoshaphat said, let not the king say so. Then the king of Israel called an officer and said, fetch quickly Micah, the son of Imlah. And you know the story. At first they send the 400 prophets, they send one of their delegations down and tell him, you just say what the king wants to hear. So he does it first, and of course, Ahab gets upset about that. He says, can you not just tell the truth? And then he says, I see Israel scattered like sheep having no shepherd. It got him angry too. Ahab put him in prison, said feed him with bread of sorrow and water of sorrow, and I'll deal with him when I get back. Micah said, if you return at all, God never spoke to me. Well, let me show you what God did say to Micah. Because not only is all this prophecy and prophetic what we're talking about, but also in the book of Micah as well. Micah also prophesied exactly of some of the things I've been telling you here, and I think you ought to see this here. When we get over here, around verse 6, in that day saith the Lord, will I assemble her that halteth, and I will gather her that is driven away, and her that I have afflicted. A prophecy of the Jewish people returning to Israel. Notice, they're lame. They're halt. And he gathers them back. That's your Holocaust Jews. That's those from the pogroms. That is those from Stalin. The Jews that come from Russia. What is it? It's the house of Judah coming home first. Not the house of Israel, mind you, but the house of Judah. And I will make her that is halted a remnant, and her that was cast far off a mighty nation. And the Lord shall reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth even forever. And thou, Migdal Eder, the hill of the daughter of Zion, unto you shall it come, yea, the former dominion shall come, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem. Now the Migdal Eder, the Hebrew words here, Migdal Eder, this is the one that is the leader over Israel. He's the one that is giving the commands of how the nation is to be run. Watch what God says to them. To the halt and lame that come back, God says, I'll be with you forever. Then God says to the one that is the leader, the leaders of Israel, He says, now why do you cry out aloud? Is there no king in thee? Remember, Samuel the prophet was God's way of leading His nation through His prophets. But Israel had to have a king. You rejected God's divine plan for you and you took a king. That's where you left God. That's where you got to go back. That's where you'll find where you left off. No wonder why God sends two witnesses. Right? Alright, and in closing, let me just say this here. Is thy counselor perished, and that pains have taken hold of thee as a woman in travail? Sure. You know, the counselor was Yeshua. He was called the Counselor, the Prince of Peace, the Mighty God. Over in where? Isaiah 9. Do you know if you go down in Isaiah 9 after it speaks about His coming, it talks about Ephraim and Manasseh are against one another and they devour one another's arm. In other words, military confrontation with each other. And then it says Ephraim and Manasseh both are against Judah. The Jews living in the land today. Don't have time to go on all that today. Notice as well that, see, has your counselor perished? The pains have taken hold of thee as a woman in travail. You forgot about Mary and what she suffered to bring forth Yeshua, because there was no place found for him in a hotel there in the Babylon where he could have been born a decent birth, like it was with Joseph when the money was returned to our bags, to our forefathers, and they were on their way back home, and they stopped at the hotel and they found their money when they were where? At the hotel. Why? Because we rejected Yeshua when He was in His mother's womb at the end, and so therefore it was a reminder to us. Many things could be said there. Be in pain and labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in travail. For now shalt thou go forth out of the city. And now thou shalt and shalt dwell in the field, and shalt come even unto Babylon. There shalt thou be rescued, and there shall the Lord redeem thee from the hand of thine enemies. You went to Rome and made your covenant. God said in the Revelation by the prophet John, who was one of Israel's last prophets of the days during the time of Yeshua, come out of her, my people, and be not partakers of her sins. But you went there anyway. So God will deliver you from right there because you went back to her. You brought idolatry back into Israel. And of course, what was it? Balaam worship. What was Jezebel? Brought Balaam worship. What did Laban say? If you take any other daughters other than my daughters, God judge between me and you. It'll take His two witnesses coming on the scene to set this right. God still loves His people. But it will be a travailing time, and we are at that travailing time. This is why we see everything going on today. And I say to my Jewish brothers and sisters, and to the Syrian people as well, there was a covenant made by our fathers. We should honor it. Thank you for watching. If this has been a blessing to you, please stand with us and support the work we're doing. We need your help in doing this. I can't do it without your friends. You are what make it happen. If it's your financial support or if it's your prayers, we need both. We need your prayers desperately bad. My wife needs your prayers for healing of her body. And we need your help in keeping this type broadcast alive, especially on World Harvest Television Network, where we will actually air this in greater detail in about a 3-part series. You help keep that going to reach those that otherwise would not hear it, that don't come here to YouTube. Thank you for watching. Share this video with as many as you can. And if you have any way to share it with any member of Knesset or Prime Minister Netanyahu directly, or that with the Syrian people, President Bashar al-Assad, please do so. I'm Stephen Ben-Nun with Israeli News Live, a prophetic segment.